The 11th of October 1942, a little before midnight, the stretch of black water between Savo Island and the shoulder of Cape Esperance, at the top of Guadalcanal, there was no moon. On the bridge of the American light cruiser Helena, men stood in the dark and watched a small glowing screen. 15 6-inch guns were trained out into nothing at all. 10 months earlier, Helena had been sitting still at a dock in Pearl Harbor, in a berth that belonged to a battleship. A Japanese aerial torpedo came in low across the harbor and struck her on the starboard side, below the waterline, into her engineering spaces. Men died down there at their stations, in the dark, before most of the ship understood what had happened to it. The shock of that same torpedo split the hull of the old mine layer moored alongside her, and that ship rolled over and settled in the mud. Helena went back to a yard on the American west coast. They pumped her out, cut the wreckage away, rebuilt her, and sent her back to the war. She came back with her main battery unchanged, and that was the part of her nobody in the Navy was proud of, because they were the wrong guns. In 1930, the United States signed a naval treaty in London that limited how many 8-inch cruisers it could build, and the Chief of Naval Operations accepted a design carrying 6-inch guns instead. The Navy's own General Board objected, and objected vehemently. They wanted the bigger gun. Among the men who wrote the requirements, a ship like Helena was the compromise, and it was not a compliment. Somewhere out in that darkness, a Japanese cruiser force was coming down the same water at speed, and the admiral leading it expected nothing at all. What Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that the compromise was about to win, that within half an hour his flagship would be a wreck under him, and that he would die without ever learning who did it to him. This is the story of a gun the United States Navy did not want, of a one-word answer that nobody meant as an order, and of a Japanese admiral who went down believing his own friends had shot him. This is the story of the night the American fleet won with the wrong weapon, and then learned exactly the wrong lesson from winning. Part 1. The gun nobody wanted. You have to understand how little the United States Navy thought of the 6-inch gun in the years before the war. In the 1920s, the 8-inch cruiser was the measure of a fleet. It threw a shell more than twice as heavy. It reached farther. Every serious officer wanted the bigger gun, and every serious officer said so in writing. Then the treaty came. It was arithmetic. It was not a choice. London capped the heavy cruisers, and the only way to keep building was to build light ones. So the United States built them, over the objections of the very men whose job was to say what a warship ought to be. The new ships were fast, well protected, and beautifully made. They simply carried a gun their own designers had argued against. Screening the carriers, escorting the transports, shelling beaches ahead of the Marines, anti-aircraft work. It was necessary work. It was not the work that made reputations. The heavy cruisers and the battleships were the ships that decided things, and every man in the fleet understood that order of precedence without anyone having to explain it. There is one more detail out of those years, and it shaped more that night than anyone realized at the time. Only the newest light cruisers carried the Navy's newest search set, the one that could draw a clean picture of ships in total darkness. Helena had it. So did her sister Boise. The heavy cruiser San Francisco did not, and Rear Admiral Norman Scott chose San Francisco as his flagship. Scott's force was called Task Force 64. San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Boise, Helena, and 5 destroyers, Fahrenholt, Duncan, Laffey, Buchanan, and McCalla. Scott had been drilling them for weeks in night formations, because the Navy had already been beaten badly in the dark off Guadalcanal, and he had decided he was not going to be beaten there again. And here is the detail that turns a treaty argument into something closer to a reckoning. Of the 4 cruisers in that column, one had already met the Japanese once, at her mooring, without warning, with her crew going to breakfast. Helena was a Pearl Harbor ship. The torpedo hole had been welded shut in California and painted over, and now she was steering toward the enemy with the same guns she had carried out of the yard. Think about what that means. The ship the Japanese had hit while she sat still was now the ship with the clearest picture of them. The Navy had spent 12 years calling her main battery a compromise, and had come close to deciding that ships like her did not matter a great deal. She was about to matter more that night than anything else in the column. Part 2. The Admiral sent to shell an airfield. Now turn the whole picture around and stand on the other bridge. Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto commanded Cruiser Division 6, and his orders that night were not to fight a battle at all. He was to cover a run of fast transports down to Guadalcanal, and then put his guns onto Henderson Field and take the American airfield out of the war. He had 3 heavy cruisers, Ioba, Furutaka, and Kinugasa, and 2 destroyers, Fubuki and Hatsuyuki. Each cruiser mounted 6 8-inch guns. Each carried torpedoes that ran farther and hit harder than anything in the American inventory. His force was strong on paper. On paper, it was stronger than the thing waiting for him at the end of the water. And he had reason to be confident, because he had done this before, in this exact water. 2 months earlier, his division had been part of the force that destroyed an Allied cruiser line off Savo Island in the dark, in a matter of minutes, without losing a ship of its own. Men who studied the action afterward came to believe he sailed in that night expecting no opposition whatsoever. He was going to shell an airfield, and he was equipped for it. But the coordination came apart before he ever laid eyes on an American. The transports had gone in ahead of him and were already unloading. His own approach ran late, and an American scout plane had found his ships in daylight, hours earlier, and reported them, so the surprise that was supposed to protect him no longer existed. He came on anyway, following his orders and a timetable. Here is what he was sailing into. The passage he had chosen narrows as it runs south, with Savo Island standing on one side of it and the coast of Guadalcanal closing on the other, and a force in column has very little room to maneuver inside it. He was in a single line, 3 cruisers with a destroyer out on either bow, closing a hostile coast in the dark at speed. And the Americans knew he was coming. They had known since the afternoon. Scott had laid his column across the mouth of that passage, so that his ships sat broadside onto a line of ships coming straight at him. Naval officers had studied that position for 100 years and almost never achieved it. There is a name for it. It is called crossing the T. But before a single American gun fired, Scott's own column came apart in front of him. He had spent weeks drilling these ships together, and in the last 20 minutes before contact, he gave one order that his captains did not all read the same way. And the confusion came first. Part 3. The turn that broke the column. It started as a routine order, and it ended with American ships firing on their own destroyers. At 33 minutes past 11, Scott ordered his force to reverse course. He meant every ship to turn in place, together, each in her own wake, and to hold her station in the line. That is not what happened. The cruisers turned the way he intended them to. But the 3 destroyers at the head of the column, Fahrenholt, Duncan and Laffey, came around as a group and found the cruiser line already steaming the other way, which left them out of position, running up the wrong side of their own force, between the American guns and the enemy. Only Scott's flagship had read the order the way he meant it, and Scott could not see any of it. He was standing on San Francisco, and San Francisco could not draw the picture. Helena could. She had the Japanese on her screen well before anyone opened fire, and she had her own strayed destroyers on it as well, and there was no way to tell her admiral which mark was which, except by voice radio, in the dark, in seconds. So for a few minutes, the strongest American surface force in those waters was being pulled apart piece by piece, not by an enemy, but by its own signals. Scott began asking whether the ships out ahead of him were his destroyers. Nobody aboard could tell him for certain. And still Goto pressed on. He was closing at speed on a line of ships he had not identified and did not expect, and as the range fell, he ordered his recognition signals made ready. Because he had already decided the shapes ahead of him were Japanese. He would not turn. At 46 minutes past 11, the range was down to 5,000 yards, less than 3 miles, point blank for a 6-inch gun, and Helena, watching the enemy fill her screen and hearing nothing at all from her admiral, put the standard question out over the voice radio. Interrogatory Roger. It meant, request permission to open fire. Part 4. the one word that was never an order. Scott answered Roger. In the Navy's signal book that night, Roger meant one thing only: message received. He was acknowledging that he had heard the question. He was not answering it. Helena's bridge took it as permission, and Helena fired. 15 guns. A 6-inch gun in one of those turrets could be worked at about 10 rounds a minute, and there were 15, which meant a single ship could put close to 150 shells a minute into the water ahead of her. At under 3 miles, in the dark, against a target not shooting back yet, the first salvos went into Ioba, Goto's own flagship, before a single Japanese gun answered. Read that again. A ship the Japanese had torpedoed at her mooring in Pearl Harbor, rebuilt around the hole they made, carrying the gun her own admirals had argued against, opened the first night surface action the American fleet would clearly win. Boise came in behind her with 15 more of the same guns. Captain Edward Moran had given his gunnery officers an order that was less a fire plan than a sentence. Pick out the biggest. Salt Lake City and San Francisco joined with their 8-inch guns. Inside a minute, the whole line was firing into a column that still had not worked out what was in front of it. That is what crossing the T does. Every American gun could bear. Goto's cruisers were in line ahead, so only their forward turrets could answer, and to use their full batteries, they would have to turn broadside in the middle of the fire, with no room. Officers had studied that geometry for generations. Almost nobody was ever handed it. And this one had not been earned. Scott crossed a Japanese admiral's T, partly through good drilling, and partly because a turn miscarried, and a one-word acknowledgement was mistaken for an order. That is worth holding on to. It is the whole point of what happened afterward. Ioba fought. She kept firing. She landed hits, and her crew stayed at guns being taken apart around them. But she was one ship pointed the wrong way at the mouth of a trap. As many as 40 shells struck her. 2 main turrets were wrecked, and so was the director that aimed the rest. Several large projectiles passed clean through her flag bridge without exploding, and the force of their passage alone mortally wounded Goto where he stood. Furitaka took gunfire and a torpedo and went down at 28 minutes past 2 in the morning. Fubuki sank. Kinugasa and Hatsuyuki got clear into the dark. It cost the Americans too. The destroyer Duncan, caught between the lines and hit from both, burned through the night and sank the next morning. 195 of her men came out of the water. 48 did not. And at 10 minutes past midnight, 2 Japanese shells went into Boise between her forward turrets, into a 6-inch magazine. 107 men were killed. The ship should have gone with them, and she was saved by the thing trying to kill her, because the sea came in through the shell holes and flooded that magazine before the powder went. Her damage became one of the first complete war damage reports the Bureau of Ships ever produced. One of the shells dug out of her had been made in England. And there is one last detail, and it is the kind of detail this whole story turns on. It changed nothing about the outcome. As the shells came in, Goto believed he was being fired on by his own side. He had been told Japanese ships were ahead, and he was still ordering recognition signals flashed while his flagship came apart. He died believing it. The truth never reached him. It never reached him at all. Part 5. The Verdict. So why did the United States Navy win that night with a gun it had voted against? And why did winning it end up costing the fleet more than the battle was ever worth? Start with the word compromise, because it was never true. It was a word about the size of a shell. A 6-inch shell weighs about 130 pounds, and an 8-inch shell weighs more than twice that, and at long range against armor that decides everything. At long range, against armor. But there was no long range off Cape Esperance. There was 5,000 yards of black water, half an hour, and a target already inside the arc of every gun in the line. The thing the 6-inch cruiser lacked did not exist that night. The thing she had, which was volume, more shells in the air per minute than anything afloat, was the only thing the situation asked for. And the General Board noticed, the men who had objected so vehemently to the 6-inch gun in 1930 read the reports coming back out of the Solomons, and they changed their minds. The official record puts it plainly. The impact of the shell changed the General Board's view on the usefulness of light cruisers in service. 12 years of argument settled by half an hour in the dark. That is the irony worth sitting with. For more than a decade, the Navy regarded these ships as the thing it had settled for. Then the first surface action the fleet clearly won was won, in the main, by their guns, while the heavy cruiser carrying the Admiral could not see the enemy at all. And then there is the thing underneath the gunnery, the thing you cannot put into a war damage report. Because the Navy took the wrong lesson out of that water, and it took it almost immediately. The victory was read, in Washington and in the fleet, as proof of something it did not prove. American gunfire had beaten a Japanese cruiser force at night. So the conclusion drawn was that the problem was solved, and that Japanese night torpedo work had been overrated all along. A junior officer aboard Helena saw it more clearly than the admirals. Cape Esperance, he wrote, was a three-sided battle in which chance was the major winner. It was luck, a turn that miscarried, a word misheard, and an enemy who believed he was among friends. 2 months later, in the same waters, off Tassafaronga, an American cruiser force went in carrying everything Cape Esperance had taught it, and Japanese destroyers put torpedoes into 4 American heavy cruisers, sank one outright, and left the others wrecked. The bill for the wrong lesson came due in about 10 minutes. Goto was carried below and died the next day, by most accounts still convinced that the shells had come from his own side. He went out of the world in the water his division had won 2 months before, giving orders to men who were not there. And most of the men in that water were not admirals, and none of them had been in the argument about gun calibers. They were kids in 6-inch turrets and handling rooms and boiler rooms, working a weapon their own service had spent 12 years apologizing for, in the dark, at 3 miles, at 10 rounds a minute, for about half an hour. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Solomons, in a cruiser or a destroyer, or in the handling rooms below one of those turrets, I would be honored to read their name and their ship in the comments. The men who were there are very nearly all gone now. What remains is what their families still carry, and this is a place where it can stay in the record. And if this is the kind of history you want told the quiet way, a small mark of approval keeps it in front of the people who care about what actually happened. Not the version that flatters, not the version that flattens, the one with the misread signal still in it. They called it a compromise. They called it the gun nobody wanted. And on a moonless night off Guadalcanal, a ship the Japanese had already torpedoed once, carrying the gun her own admirals had voted down, was handed a Japanese column by an order that miscarried and a word that was misunderstood, and she took that column apart with it. The Navy won that night with the wrong weapon. Then it believed the wrong thing about why.